On August 1st, 2008, 25 climbers left Camp 4 under clear skies and perfect conditions. They had no idea that within 48 hours, 11 of them would be dead, and that the mountain they were climbing wouldn't even have the decency to make it look like a fight. Because K2 doesn't do that, and that's why it's far more dangerous than Everest. K2 sits at 8,611 meters in the Karakoram Range on the Pakistan-China border, and if Everest is the mountain everyone knows by name, K2 is the one that mountaineers actually fear. The routes are steeper, the weather is more volatile, and the death rate per summit attempt is nearly double Everest's. The slopes rise at angles of 45 degrees or more across a mix of limestone and ice that turns every step into a negotiation, and K2's own weather system can turn a clear morning into a lethal blizzard within minutes. In short, it doesn't just challenge you, it preys on you. And on August 1st, 2008, it had been looking to prey on a team of 25 humans for weeks. The group was multinational: Norwegians, Dutch, South Koreans, Serbians, Americans, a Frenchman, and solo climbers from Spain and Italy. Different teams and nationalities sharing the same summit window, loosely coordinated, bound together by the rare gift of good conditions. They departed Camp 4 in the early hours of August 1st with everything pointing in their favor. Clear skies, manageable wind, temperatures that while brutal were within the range of survivable. The kind of day K2 offers once in a season if you're lucky, and the kind of day that makes 25 people believe they're about to do something extraordinary. They were right about the extraordinary part. The first problem arrived at the bottleneck. The bottleneck is the section of the K2 route that separates the serious climbers from the summit, and on bad days, the living from the dead. It's a steep, narrow couloir, essentially a chute in the ice, that all climbers must pass through to reach the summit pyramid, and above it hangs the Serac Field, massive blocks of glacial ice, each weighing tens of thousands of tons, that cling to the mountain with the specific kind of indifference that makes them so terrifying. They can release without warning, they give no indication of timing, and climbers passing through the bottleneck below them are, in those minutes, completely at the mercy of ice that doesn't know they're there. On the morning of August 1st, the bottleneck became a traffic jam, 25 climbers moving at different paces through a section that requires single-file progress, with limited fixed rope and the kind of altitude-induced slowness that turns 100 meters into an hour of grinding effort. And it was in this traffic jam, on a section where every second of delay has compounding consequences, that the first death happened. Dren Mandic, a Serbian climber, made a seemingly simple decision. He unclipped from the fixed rope, possibly to adjust his oxygen system or pass another climber, and in the thin air and exhaustion of the bottleneck, that simple decision cost him his balance. He fell. The people near him watched in the frozen horror of high altitude, that specific helplessness where your body can't move fast enough to matter, as Mandic tumbled down the steep slope below. It was a long, terrible fall, and when he finally stopped moving, he stood up. Climbers watching from Camp 4 through binoculars exhaled. He had survived it, and then he collapsed again and didn't move, and the day had its first death before the sun was fully up. What happened next illustrates something about human decision-making at extreme altitude that is both understandable and, in retrospect, devastating. Two of Mandic's Serbian teammates and a Pakistani high-altitude porter named Jahan Baig began descending toward him, driven by loyalty, by the bond between teammates, by the refusal to leave one of their own on the mountain. They were joined by two others, and the plan that emerged was to bring Mandic's body back to Camp 4, a decision rooted in dignity and grief that did not adequately account for the physics of moving dead weight down a 45-degree ice slope at 8,000 meters. Baig had already been showing signs of altitude sickness before the descent began. Disoriented, erratic, offering to help, and then refusing, and then offering again in the cycling confusion that oxygen deprivation produces in the brain. As the group attempted to lower Mandic's body, Baig became increasingly unstable. The body's weight caused sudden jerks on the rope. Baig lost his footing, panicked, grabbed for the ropes, bumped into a teammate who shouted at him to let go. He let go, and then he began sliding, picking up speed on the ice, and he did not attempt to self-arrest, did not drive his ice axe into the slope the way every climber learns to stop exactly this kind of fall. and he went over the edge of a massive cornice and disappeared. By 12:30 p.m., 2 men were dead and 23 climbers remained, and the summit was still above them. Here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. At this point, with 2 deaths already logged before midday, why did no one turn back? The answer is the same answer that appears in almost every Everest and K2 disaster story ever written, and it never gets less uncomfortable to confront. They were close. The weather was still good, the summit was still visible, and the specific psychological phenomenon that mountaineers call summit fever, the narrowing of cognitive bandwidth that altitude and obsession produce together, where the summit consumes so much mental real estate that everything else shrinks in relative importance, was already well established in most of the group. Turning back at that point felt like losing something. It turned out to be the only thing that could have saved some of them. The climbers pressed on through the bottleneck, now 6 hours behind schedule, a delay that on a mountain like K2, where the descent must be completed before weather and darkness close the window, is not an inconvenience but a death sentence written in pencil that the mountain has the option to make permanent at any time. The fixed ropes above the bottleneck were another problem. The trail breakers found that the established ropes had been supplemented with 8mm cord left from the previous season. A year of exposure to UV radiation, extreme cold, and the mechanical stress of ice movement had left rope that should not have been trusted with a single climber's weight, let alone 23 of them moving in sequence. It was what they had. Norwegian climber Rolf Bay made the decision to turn back just 100 meters below the summit, a decision that, in the mathematics of what followed, was the correct one, even though he didn't survive to benefit from it. He urged his wife, Cecilia Skog, and their friend to continue, and waited just above the traverse to watch their progress. Cecilia made the summit, and then, on the descent, she watched her husband swept off the mountain in a serac fall. This detail doesn't get easier with repetition. She had climbed past him on the way up, and was descending toward him when he was gone. The first climber reached the summit at 3 p.m. By 7:30 p.m., the last climber, Marco Confortola, stood at the top of K2 as the sun was setting. The summit had been reached. The descent, which is where most K2 deaths occur and where most of the nightmare still waiting for this group lived, was about to begin. In the darkness, the situation unraveled with a speed that the daylight hours hadn't prepared anyone for. Hugo Doberade, the French climber, was out of oxygen and too exhausted to maintain a safe descent pace. His high-altitude porter Karim had disappeared somewhere near the summit. As Cas van de Gevel descended through the bottleneck in darkness, he heard a sound, a thud, then tumbling, and a human shape hurtled past him into the void below. He believed it was Doberade. The mountain was collecting its debts in the dark, and nobody could see clearly enough to know the full extent of what was happening around them. Marco Confortola, descending separately, reported hearing screams and seeing headlamps flicker and vanish. He bivouacked on the slope, not by choice, but by exhaustion, and spent the night at altitude in a situation that most climbers do not survive. Morning brought a different kind of horror. Above the traverse, 3 South Korean climbers and their guide were found tangled in ropes, hanging upside down, bloodied, alive but trapped in a configuration that nobody could immediately explain. Whether a serac fall, an avalanche, or a conventional fall had caused it wasn't clear. What was clear was that cutting the ropes that held them would kill them, and leaving them would kill them, and getting to them required climbing back up into the bottleneck when the seracs above were now known to be actively releasing. Wilco van Rooyen, descending in failing eyesight in the early stages of snowblindness, stopped long enough to hand his spare gloves to the group's surviving guide before continuing down, knowing that stopping meant dying. You cannot fault that calculation at 8,000 meters. You also cannot pretend it felt like a choice. Gerard McDonnell, an Irish climber, made the opposite decision. He climbed back up to find the anchor points trapping the Koreans, working for hours to free them in conditions that were deteriorating by the minute. He got them free. He repositioned them, and then a serac fell, and Gerard McDonnell was swept away, and the 3 Korean climbers he had just freed were swept away with him. And the serac fall that followed shortly after took the 2 Sherpas who had come up to help them, sparing only the one who had been climbing more slowly and hadn't yet reached the others. In the space of a few hours, the bottleneck had taken most of its toll. By this point, Pemba Gyalja, a Sherpa who had climbed the entire mountain without supplemental oxygen and had been making correct, measured decisions at every stage, found himself essentially alone at Camp 4 with a rescue situation unfolding in multiple directions simultaneously. He received radio calls from Confortola, still on the slope, barely conscious, frostbitten, 30+ hours into an ordeal that had started as a summit push. Pemba went up alone. He reached Confortola and began bringing him down, and the fact that both of them survived this particular part of the story is largely a function of Pemba making the right decision at every point where the wrong one was tempting. Wilco van Rooyen had by this point been on K2 for more than 40 hours in conditions that had taken 11 people who started the day with him. He was snowblind, dehydrated, frostbitten, and navigating by radio guidance from a teammate watching through a telescope at base camp thousands of meters below, calling out adjustments the way you'd guide someone through a room in the dark, except the room was a mountain in the Karakoram and the darkness was complete. Pemba and Cas van de Gevel found him through that process, which remains one of the more remarkable pieces of coordination in the entire disaster, and brought him down. By late evening on August 3rd, Pemba, Cas, and Wilco reached base camp. Wilco received treatment for frostbite that had progressed through his toes and hands while he was walking on them for 2 days. Confortola arrived last, evacuated by helicopter, the final survivor of what had been the worst 48 hours in K2's history. 11 deaths, 11 people who had left Camp 4 on August 1st under clear skies with summit windows and good conditions and plans. The survivors gathered and shared the last can of beer that Gerard McDonald had saved for their return, a gesture that McDonald himself had made as a promise about coming back, and that his teammates honored in his absence with the specific silence of people who understand what they're drinking to. K2 wouldn't be summited again until 2011. The mountain characteristically had nothing to say about any of it.